Why did Somoza leave Nicaragua in July 1979? It was clear to many people that Somoza and his family had to end their monopoly on power. While more and more groups required that the regime end immediately, others, like the United States government, wanted slow, smooth transition to a new power. Many feared that a sudden change would lead to a Sandinista takeover, which they believed would then lead to some form of communist system. August 22, 1978, 25 Sandinistas, dressed as National Guardsmen, seized the National Palace where the Nicaraguan Congress was in session and where the ministers of France and of the Interior had their offices. Approximately 1,500 government employees were busy going about their various tasks that morning. The entire building was under Sandinista control within 20 minutes, and Somoza's cousin, his nephew, and the Minister of Interior were among the captives, along with almost all members of the Nicaraguan Congress. Sandinistas asked the Archbishop Obando to come to the palace to receive their list of demands. The leader of the Sandinista raid, Eden Pastora, explained to reporters that he was not a communist as the government would have people believe, but was a practicing Catholic, and that Cuba was not behind the raid as the government stated. Their demands were the release of 83 prisoners, 10 million in cash, and publication of a series of Sandinista statements. On the second day of the siege, 300 people were released, mostly women and children, but 1,200 remained under Sandinista control. Negotiations led to 50 prisoners being released. The other 33 were not in prison, and 500,000 being delivered. Sandinista statements were published in the Somoza-owned newspaper and filled 6 pages. These included a demand to abolish the National Guard, a call to create a national army after Somoza, and criticism of various political groups for negotiating with Somoza to achieve his departure. On August 24th, planes from the governments of Venezuela and Panama arrived to collect the rebels and former prisoners. Sandinistas left the palace with a few prize hostages, including Somoza's cousin, and were escorted by Archbishop Obando. They were cheered by thousands of well-wishers lining the road to the airport. The Sandinista raid had the immediate effect of energizing the population against Somoza, making the efforts of more moderate opposition groups seem timid or somehow not anti-Somoza enough to many. On August 25th, the FAO announced a general strike to show that they remained politically relevant after the daring Sandinista raid. At about the same time, disaffected youths not affiliated with the Sandinistas battled the National Guard troops in northern cities for 5 days. A few weeks later, the government arrested the leaders of the FAO-sponsored strike and of several political parties, and then hundreds of others that it believed were behind recent disturbances. As the government made arrests, the Sandinistas launched simultaneously assaults on the National Guard positions all over the country. The attacks were simple. Guard positions were briefly assaulted and the Sandinistas quickly retreated. In some cities, local people continued fighting the National Guard after the Sandinistas departed. The National Guard responded to these attacks with major force, killing 63 rebels and several hundred civilians, even bombing buildings by air and crossing briefly into Costa Rica to attack Sandinista camps. Around 200 Sandinistas sought asylum at Central and South American embassies as a result of the National Guard actions. As dramatic as the Sandinistas had been, the vast majority were now either dead or leaving the country for exile. They were soon joined by hundreds of Nicaraguan youth, inspired especially by the raid on the National Palace. They crossed the border into Costa Rica into Sandinista training camps. The USA called on the OAS to help find a solution to the crisis after coming to the conclusion that its earlier emphasis on human rights had achieved Little. Somoza was visited by the U.S. ambassador who told him he should consider resigning and that U.S. policy was now to plan for a post-Somoza government. The U.S. change in policy was the result of concern about growing support for the Marxist-affiliated Sandinistas. It was also realized that Somoza had few supporters outside the National Guard. Somoza had alienated the Catholic Church, all political parties, and most business owners. The U.S. sought moderate politicians who would have broad-based appeal to replace Somoza, fearing a potential Sandinista government that would oppose U.S. policies in the midst of the Cold War. Somoza, under pressure, accepted an OAS committee to help resolve the crisis. The committee was composed of representatives of 3 nations, the USA, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. While negotiations occurred, the U.S. requested that Venezuela, Costa Rica, and Panama curtail their support for Sandinista guerrillas, and they complied. The OAS committee insisted on a plebiscite in Nicaragua to allow people to vote on whether they wanted Somoza to remain in power or for him to resign and go into exile. Somoza made various counterproposals, and eventually talks ended in mid-January 1979. It was clear to the OAS mediators that Somoza had no intention of allowing a plebiscite. It was also clear to U.S. President Carter, Venezuela's President Perez, and others that Somoza had no intention of stepping aside. He continued to insist on U.S. support, giving the alternative of a communist Nicaragua if Sandinistas or their allies came to power. The U.S. cut off military and other aid to Nicaragua in response to failed mediation, and Somoza turned to Israel and Guatemala to keep his forces supplied, purchasing primarily rifles and ammunitions. Failure of 4 months of OAS efforts to defuse a crisis meant that moderates, which included the Catholic Church, the FAO, and others, had to choose between Somoza and the growing Sandinista movement. Most were surprised that the U.S. seemed incapable or unwilling to force a solution considering the political stakes, but the U.S. government under Carter refused to force changes in the governments of other nations. Negotiations were conducted and failing, Sandinistas resupplied and reorganized. In December 1978, they announced from Cuba that the 3 Sandinista factions were once again united and working together. 3 representatives from each faction created the new National Directorate to lead and coordinate Sandinista policy and activities. Meanwhile, the flow of weapons, primarily rifles and ammunition, increased. Cuba was the main supplier of these materials, shipping them through Panama to Sandinista camps in Costa Rica. By June 1979, Cuba sent weapons directly to the Sandinistas in Costa Rica as Panama came under U.S. pressure to cease the flow of arms. Sandinista guerrillas in Costa Rica came to be called the Southern Front, while rebels who had been part of the prolonged war faction based themselves in Honduras, forming the Northern Front. The Northern Front was a much smaller group, but was the first to strike. In the resulting chaos, the National Guard had 1,000 troops in position and were supported by tank and aircraft. They surrounded the town, cutting off its water and electricity. The National Guard fought this northern front of guerrillas street by street. Artillery helped to level part of the city, and a few days later, the guerrillas escaped at night. The heavy-handed tactics of the Guard brought much criticism internationally. Nicaraguans were shocked at the level of destruction inflicted on the town to just defeat a few hundred rebels. Small battles erupted across the north and west of Nicaragua from April to June. While not on the scale of the attack in the north, there was much destruction. On June 11th, during fighting in the industrial areas, National Guard tanks destroyed the building of La Prensa, the opposition newspaper. Around this time, Somoza sent his best National Guard troops to the southern border, which the Sandinistas were crossing to attack Guard outposts and border control stations. At least 130 Sandinistas were killed while making no headway into Nicaragua. It is estimated that Sandinistas had only 1,500 guerrilla fighters, both men and women, on the southern front, making these casualties significant. Mexico cut relations with Nicaragua in May 1979, following Costa Rica, which had done so in late 1978 as a result of Nicaraguan attacks across the border. This added international pressure, and these states called for opposition leaders to form a provisional government to lead a post-Somoza Nicaragua. In response to these demands, leaders of the FAO, the Los Dos, and the Sandinistas in exile in Costa Rican capital in San Jose formed a provisional government called the Junta of National Reconstruction. Members of the junta were, for instance, Robela, the former leader of COSIP and the leader of FAO. He was clearly a moderate. Then there was Violeta Chamorro. She was Chamorro's widow, who would appeal to those who thought her husband was a martyr. There was Sergio Ramirez, a well-known writer. Daniel Ortega, who would become very famous in Nicaraguan history. And then lastly was Moses Hassan, a famous academic. The U.S. suddenly became more active as events moved quickly, deciding to treat Somoza less gently and without involving other nations. The new U.S. ambassador to Nicaragua, Laurent Petsuzo, met Somoza and presented him with an ultimatum on June 18th. He said, "You will resign in a dignified manner. You will help form a unity government of representatives of all political parties. You will allow the OAS to organize national elections. You will appoint a new leader of the National Guard that is not a relative. You can come live in the U.S. if you do all the above. If you do not, expect to be completely cut off and suffer sanctions. You have 1 day to make a decision." Somoza responded 1 hour before the deadline on June 19th. He said that the U.S. ultimatum is not appreciated or respected. I will resign if the OAS can create a stable transition of power. I must have a promise to not be extradited from the United States to any other country in case of future trials, and the entire Somoza family must receive visas to live in permanent exile in the United States. Also on June 19th, the junta announced many of its intentions and plans for Nicaragua. They were all property owned by the Somoza family would be confiscated. Nicaragua would be allied to any other country, including the USA, or would not be allied to any other country. There would be a social and economic reconstruction program. Nicaragua would be a multi-party state with complete freedom of speech and religion. Nicaragua would honor all its foreign debt, and the National Guard would be dissolved and a new army created, where most members of the Guard would find jobs if they left the Guard immediately. On June 23rd, the OAS passed a resolution calling for Somoza to be replaced with an interim government, but refused U.S. pressure to organize and support an international police force to help with the transition. The OAS resolution also demanded a ceasefire by all groups and an arms embargo. The OAS and the USA were, however, becoming irrelevant as events in Nicaragua were moving faster than anticipated. The battles between the Sandinistas and the National Guard had not only damaged cities throughout the country, but also exhausted the population, many of whom had fled to other areas. On June 17th, National Guard troops abandoned all of León, the second largest city in Nicaragua. On June 24th, Masaya, near the capital, was captured by Sandinistas, when it too was abandoned by the National Guard. Other cities were soon captured either by the youth, not the Sandinistas, and they drove out the National Guard, demonstrating that many people supported Sandinista efforts, but were now willing to take matters into their own hands. A national strike was called by businesses and labor unions, while foreigners fled the country in anticipation of a major battle in and around the capital city. While it appeared to many that the Sandinistas were winning the war, the reality was that the National Guard not only controlled the vast majority of the country, they also inflicted heavy defeats on the guerrillas. The National Guard numbered about 10,000 men by the end of June 1979, as the government recruited more members. Battles in the north continued. The larger southern front faced Somoza's best guard troops. 300 guerrillas were killed in the battle on the Costa Rican border, and 100 more died when attempting to reach Rivas, a leading city between Costa Rica and the capital of Nicaragua, Managua. Pastora, one of the Southern Front leaders, sent a message to U.S. President Carter through a former Costa Rican president asking for the USA to get Somoza to remove National Guard forces opposing him. Pastora was not a Marxist and was the most moderate member of the Sandinista leadership. He explained clearly to Carter that he was very popular, and if he could take control of Managua, he could prevent a takeover of the country by more radical Sandinistas. The USA refused, hoping for a stalemate between the two sides so that it could manage the transition itself to form a government that it felt most comfortable with. The five-member junta was approved by the United States, and 12 individuals would serve as ministers in the cabinet of the transition government. The cabinet integrated Sandinistas, former National Guard members of Los Dos, and others. This alleviated U.S. concerns that the future of Nicaragua would be dominated by Marxist-leaning Sandinistas. On the same day, Somoza replaced his half-brother on the National Guard. Most National Guard officers were tired by Somoza's dying government at the same time. Then, on July 12th, Somoza selected Francisco Urquijo as the temporary transition president for whenever Somoza left the country. Somoza's resignation was announced to Congress at 1 a.m. on July 17th, when Urquijo. Later in the morning on July 17th, U.S. Ambassador Pazula met Urquijo and informed him that he needed to resign and be replaced by Archbishop Obando, who would shortly afterwards turn over power to the junta. Urquijo refused, stating that he would violate the nation's constitution and that he had no intention of having anything to do with a group that he considered to be communist. After Pazula's departure, Urquijo named new cabinet ministers and formed a government, refusing to believe he had little support in the country and that the National Guard's strength was dissolving. The National Guard informed him that they were running out of ammunition and had little fuel for their vehicles. The National Guard continued to prevent the southern front of Sandinistas from entering the country, but fell apart elsewhere, allowing the Sandinistas to gain control over other cities, helped by excited teenagers. By July 18th, the National Guard was falling apart as officers fled to Honduras or went into hiding with their troops. The National Guard director attempted to arrange a ceasefire with the Sandinistas, but the rebel leadership demanded unconditional surrender, something the National Guard refused to do. In order to prevent a military takeover by the Sandinistas, then the implementation of a Marxist state by its more radical members, the president of Costa Rica flew the five-member junta to León to establish the transition government. It was hoped that with this group in the country, it would assume leadership of the political scene and place the Sandinista guerrillas under its control. Urquijo was finally aware that he could not remain Nicaraguan president as the airport came under Sandinista attack and the National Guard disappeared from the city. The Guatemalan Air Force evacuated him, his family, and the newly named government ministers. On July 19th, National Guard troops in Managua surrendered to the Red Cross, as commanded by the highest-ranking officer left in the city, the head of the traffic police. Thousands of troops were sent to part of the airport, which was declared a special Red Cross zone, while others surrendered themselves and their weapons to the Red Cross at hospitals, schools, and other locations. Officers were sent to the Venezuelan embassy by Red Cross officials, where they would be safe from potential reprisals by Sandinistas and their allied youth. The 1,000 National Guardsmen who had defended the southern border so successfully now retreated and seized boats in the harbor to take them to El Salvador. Around 2,000 guards fled to Honduras, many on foot, abandoning their homes and possessions out of fear for their lives. On July 20th, the junta arrived in Managua on top of a fire engine, cheered by tens of thousands of people. Many wondered if the revolution had finished, or was it just beginning? Sandinistas were firmly in power by the end of 1979, if not by mid-July. While the Sandinistas claimed victory, victory was not achieved by force of arms. The Sandinistas were a relatively small group that had few weapons other than rifles, often lacking ammunition, proper training, or combat experience. They were daring for sure, carrying out the spectacular Christmas party raid and seizing the National Palace. At no point, however, did they ever come close to having the same numbers or armed strength of the National Guard. The Somoza regime lost practically all support by organized groups in the country by early 1979, if not by 1978. The regime was not under major military pressure from the Sandinistas, but was under pressure from business leaders in urban centers, from the Catholic Church, which most people held in high regard, and from the United States. All these groups feared the possibility of the Sandinistas overthrowing the established order with violence, which they certainly tried to do with very limited success, especially in the South. In order to prevent a civil war, Somoza was pushed into leaving the country by the United States, Nicaraguan political groups, and even neighboring states. Yet the departure of Somoza, which was demanded by practically everyone with a political voice, caused the entire system to collapse. The only armed group, the Sandinistas, was then able to seize power through its manipulation of the junta, on which it secretly had a majority. After proclaiming victory, the Sandinistas could then create a real revolution for the country in terms of social, economic, and political changes.